At the doctor's office, my son barked, "She's not worth a bandage." The doctor replied, "Funny, she pays for the entire ward." And there was a hush in the fluorescent light that made the linoleum look like winter water, slick and cold, while I sat with my coat on my lap and my purse on the coat and my hands on the purse as if I were balancing a stack of porcelain that might tip if I breathed too loudly, which I did not, because I learned long ago that the safest way to be an old woman is to make yourself the quietest thing in the room and let the noise spill past you like a river that has forgotten your name. I am 81. My knees complain in weather. My hearing is fine when people assume it isn't. And I live now in a small third-floor apartment with a view of the church parking lot and a maple that insists on turning scandalously red each October, as if to remind me that even the modest can blaze when the air is right. And on most mornings I smooth the quilt, tidy the cup that holds my pills, pin my bus pass to the inside of my coat, the way women used to hide cash in hems, then walk to the stop with the slow dignity of someone no longer rushing to make anyone else's breakfast. But that day, my son insisted on driving because I had bruised my shin on the edge of the bed frame, an ordinary bruise with the ordinary ache of a body that has kept its promises for a long time. And he arrived in a jacket that smelled like a new car and concern rehearsed for an audience. And he loaded me into the passenger seat with a kind of gentle roughness that belongs to people who treat kindness as a task that must be done quickly before it curdles. And we passed the bakery I used to take him to when cupcakes were still considered a celebration and not a sin. And I almost mentioned the time he dropped the one with the blue frosting and cried until I ate the fallen half so he wouldn't feel alone in the loss. But then we were at the clinic and he was tapping at his phone as we moved through the sliding doors that opened with a sigh like a tired maid. And the waiting room smelled of lemon cleaner and old magazines and the faint afterbreath of pain. And the nurse at the desk, sweet thing with a name tag that said Ellie and a tiny enamel dove pinned beside it, asked for insurance and emergency contact and who would be responsible for payment if any procedure was necessary. And I opened my mouth because my tongue still remembers how to form my own name, but my son leaned forward on his elbows and gave the kind of laugh that sharpens itself against other people's ears, and said that line, the line that will live longer than his beard or his certainty. "She's not worth a bandage." And he said it in the tone men use when they want to sound practical rather than cruel. And my heart, which has survived childbirth, funerals, the year we ate potatoes, 3 ways to keep the lights on, did not so much break as purse its lips like a teacher in an empty hall. And before the air could decide whether to tremble, the doctor stepped from the doorway, a woman my age would have been when I was still going to the office in low heels and a blouse that held the smell of copy paper. And she said, "Funny, she pays for the entire ward," with a dry kindness that landed like a hand on the back to keep me from falling. And I realized she knew more than she should have, given I had been anonymous in my giving, because when the oncology wing wrote asking to put my name on a plaque, I told them no, that a name on a wall is a small thing compared to a bed for someone's mother at 2 a.m. And I remember my son telling me at the time that anonymity was classy, that we were a family that did not make a spectacle, though I see now he meant a different kind of spectacle entirely, the kind where an old woman becomes a prop with a purse, and I sat there in my wool dress that pills at the elbows and my sensible shoes whose laces remember the shape of my fingers. And I thought of the first check I wrote to this building when it was just concrete and promise, the way the pen shook because I was afraid of what I was doing, and also thrilled to learn that fear and joy sometimes share a doorway. And I thought of the last time my husband's handwriting appeared on a deposit slip, narrow, neat letters like rails, and how he had leaned across the kitchen table and said, "If you can help a place where people bleed and then go home, do it," and how I had folded that sentence into my wallet as if it were currency, and now here I was, old but not a ghost, bruised but not broken, listening to my own son audition for the role of guardian while understudying the part of beneficiary, and the doctor's eyes, cool, bright, not cruel, met mine for a fragment of a second, and something generous passed between us, the way a small wrapped candy moves from palm to palm at church without anybody confessing to a sweet tooth. And I thought, I am not a ledger entry. I am not their winter coat to be put on when the cold arrives and forgotten when the tulips push through. I am a woman whose hands learned to sterilize instruments before dishwashers were common, who ran nighttime bake sales by checkbook light to keep the neighborhood clinic open, who once walked 2 miles in the snow after my car died because Mrs. Ortega needed someone to sit with her, and I knew that being sat with is sometimes the difference between staying and stepping off the edge. And yet, even with all that history, my voice did what old women's voices often do when the wind is strong. It tucked itself inside my ribs and waited, because I have learned the survival art of saving my words for when they will not be thrown back like fish too small to keep. And when the nurse asked gently whether I felt safe at home, I answered in a tone I reserve for tax questions and funerals that yes, of course, home has many definitions, though in truth, the place where I sleep has lately felt like a well-appointed hallway. And when she knelt to look at the bruise, her breath warm as laundry over the skin, the doctor stood slightly behind her and said, "We'll clean this up, we'll bandage it properly." And something so quiet rose in me that I nearly mistook it for sorrow until I recognized it as anger grown patient over years, and I let my gaze drift to the poster about fall prevention, blocky cartoons of rugs and bad shoes, and thought how no one ever hangs a poster about preventing a different kind of fall, the gradual push of a family's convenience, the gentle theft of signatures, the way a son's voice can be sandpaper over the grain of your days until you believe you were always meant to splinter. And I should tell you, since we are being honest, that I am not helpless and I am not poor, that I receive a pension I earned, alphabetizing other people's mess, that I have savings set aside in accounts with boring names, that I keep my own bus card where no one thinks to look because people assume old women do not ride late, and that most nights I sleep with the window cracked so I can hear the distant freight train moaning as it pulls through the dark, that friendly sound that reminds me the world is a set of tracks with many stations. And the trick is remembering you are allowed to step off where the light pleases you. And perhaps I should also tell you that the doctor's quip was not a performance, that later I learned she knew the amounts because she had once been a resident when our small clinic merged with the hospital and my check kept a lab tech from being fired, that she remembered the day her supervisor said, "Some grandmother with a stubborn signature saved your shift," and that the memory had lingered like the trace of cologne on a coat. And so when my son performed his crisp sentence, he did not understand he had spoken it in front of someone whose gratitude was deep and quiet and in no mood to indulge any more theater. And I, who have survived my share of shows, did what women like me do when a stage suddenly brightens. I smiled at nothing and at everything, at my purse and at the maple and at the thought of the bench outside my building where I like to sit at dusk and listen to the church bell bargaining with the birds. And I said to the nurse, who had freckles like commas across her nose, that she could give me whatever they gave the stubborn and the cautious, and she laughed softly and wrote something on her pad that looked like mercy. And if you ask me where I live, I will tell you truthfully, I live between the bus stop and the kettle, between the recipe box and the elevator mirror, where I practice looking unafraid. And if you ask me who I am, I will say, I am the woman who keeps a fresh handkerchief folded like a small flag in my sleeve, who tips in cash, who knows the name of the janitor at the clinic and the guard who changes the water in the roses by the statue in the lobby, who once believed the highest good was being useful and is learning, belatedly, but not too late, that the highest good might be refusing to be useful to anyone who will not look you in the eyes and call you by the name you stitched into every new school shirt with the dull needle you kept on a saucer. And in that room where my son had displayed his thrift of tenderness and the doctor had corrected the arithmetic, I sat with my hands settled and my mouth quiet, and I thought, this is not the end of anything. This is the rehearsal. This is the part of the story where the old woman folds her coat neatly over her knees and considers, carefully and at last, without fear, which door she will choose when they tell her to wait. That night, after the visit to the doctor, after the silence in the car that felt like a long hallway with no doors, he dropped me off at my building without even walking me to the entrance. He said, "Don't strain that leg, Mom. I'll check on you in a few days," as if I were a chore on a list that could be postponed indefinitely, as if care had an expiration date. I nodded, holding my purse like it could balance the weight of what I wanted to say, but didn't. I went up in the elevator alone, the kind that smells faintly of bleach and old perfume, and when I reached my floor, I sat down on the small bench in the hallway before unlocking my door because I didn't trust my hands not to shake. I could still hear the doctor's voice, calm and dry and almost amused. Funny, she pays for the entire ward. It had sliced through the room with surgical precision, a clean cut that left my son blinking, and I wondered if he would remember it later, or if he would fold it neatly into his mind's drawer of things to ignore. I made tea that night, the old way, kettle on the stove, no microwave, no timer, just the rising hiss and that small burst of steam that feels like breath after crying. The tea tasted bitter. I couldn't tell if it was oversteeped or if something in me had changed flavor. I didn't sleep much, and when I did, I dreamed of standing in a corridor lined with closed doors, each labeled with the names of the things I had given away: youth, sleep, savings, forgiveness. I woke at 4 a.m. to the dull ache of my leg and the sharper ache of memory. In the morning, the phone rang early. It was him. His tone was brisk, practiced. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe it's time we get your finances a little more organized. It's confusing for you to manage all that paperwork now. Carla's great with numbers. She could take over." He didn't ask. He stated. I said, "I've been balancing accounts longer than you've been alive." And he laughed, light and hollow, the way people laugh when they think they're covering irritation with charm. "Sure, Mom," he said, "but we just want to make sure everything's smooth. You know, just in case something happens." That phrase, "just in case something happens," rolled around my head like a marble in a tin cup. I'd heard it before, from nurses when my husband was sick, from bankers when I opened an account, from myself when I checked the locks before bed. It was a phrase that lived at the edge of fear, but now it sounded like a key turning quietly in a door that wasn't mine. 2 days later, he came over with a folder. He called it streamlining. Inside were forms that shimmered with the cold language of institutions: power of attorney, account consolidation, medical proxy. He spread them out on the table between the sugar bowl and the jar of jam, as if they were placemats for a meal we were about to share. I read the first line and felt my eyes blur, not from weakness, but from the thick realization that I had seen this choreography before, in other women's lives, in neighbors who used to be looked after, until they vanished into facilities with names that sounded like gardens. I said, "I don't need this," and he said, "It's for your protection." The way he said protection made me picture a fence being built not around me, but around my access to the world. I didn't sign. He didn't argue. He only smiled that tight, polite smile people wear when they're promising themselves they'll find another way. That night, my mailbox held a thin envelope from my bank, addressed to me, but with a note attached. All correspondence now forwarded to secondary address. I called the branch, and the woman on the line told me cheerfully that your son authorized the change. I asked what authorization she meant. "We have a signed document, Mrs. Holloway," she said, "from your son, Daniel Holloway." My full name, his voice attached to it like a parasite. I asked her to fax me a copy, though I don't own a fax machine anymore. I said it out of habit, from the years when proof was something you could hold. Later, I went to the bank in person. I put on my navy coat, the one with deep pockets, and walked the 4 blocks, ignoring the dull pulse in my leg. The air was sharp with March cold. Inside, the bank was too warm, the way artificial heat always feels like flattery. The teller was young, maybe 25, hair like copper wire. When I asked for the manager, she looked at me with that half concern, half condescension that the young reserve for the old. The manager was a man with smooth hands who spoke to me as if he were reading from a teleprompter. "It's all standard procedure," he said. "Your son simply updated contact preferences." I asked if he was allowed to do that without my consent. The man hesitated, then said, "It's a joint account, ma'am." I didn't remember ever making it joint. The signature on the form, when he showed me, looked like mine, but not quite. The L was shorter, the O too round, as if someone had practiced but not perfected imitation. My chest felt hollow and hot at once. I didn't make a scene. I thanked him, took the photocopy, and left. At home, I sat at the table with the papers spread out like tarot cards predicting betrayal. I looked at the handwriting. The forged parts had a kind of arrogance to them, a confidence that assumed I wouldn't notice. That assumption angered me more than the theft itself. There's a particular insult in being robbed by someone who believes you too slow to notice. I boiled water for another cup of tea, but the kettle shrieked before I could calm myself enough to lift it. I turned off the stove, sat down again, and began to write a letter, not to him, but to myself. "Remember," I wrote, "you have lived through wars, through deaths, through years when the rent rose and the pay didn't. You can live through this." I folded the letter and placed it under the sugar jar. It wasn't strategy, it was reminder. A week later, I got a call from Carla, her voice wrapped in the false brightness of people who have rehearsed pity. "Mom," she said, "Daniel's worried. You've been emotional. Maybe it's time we help manage things. You've got so many little expenses. Maybe we can close some of those old accounts." The way she said little turned my life into dust motes. I told her I would think about it. When I hung up, I realized that every call now began with concern and ended with subtraction. I started keeping small notes, names of tellers, dates, times. The accountant's voice on voicemail, the one that accidentally mentioned liquidating. I kept everything, I wrote it all in the back of my old calendar where birthdays used to go. I wasn't sure yet what I was building, evidence, courage, or both, but it made me feel less invisible. The next Sunday, Daniel came to take me to lunch. He chose a cafe I used to love, but now it was full of strangers with laptops and minimalist decor that looked allergic to comfort. He ordered for both of us without asking, something with quinoa that tasted like dust, pretending to be virtue. "Mom," he said between bites, "we just want what's best for you." That phrase, "what's best for you," is always the preamble to theft. I looked at him across the table and saw the same jawline I used to kiss goodnight when he was 8, when he still smelled of soap and imagination. I wanted to believe he was still somewhere in there, but people grow new skins, and sometimes they never take them off. I said, "Best for me or easiest for you?" He didn't answer, only smiled as if the question were impolite. That night, I opened my small lockbox. Inside were my late husband's watch, my birth certificate, an old savings passbook from when interest meant something, and one thin envelope labeled hospital donation. I hadn't looked at it in years. Inside was the letter from the foundation thanking me for my contribution, with the amount written in black ink. When I saw the number, I felt the old tremor of pride I used to confuse with love. I had kept that hospital alive for 2 winters, paid nurses overtime, funded a wing where people without insurance could be treated. And now, years later, my own son could say I wasn't worth a bandage. The irony was almost mathematical. That realization, more than the forged signature, more than the folder, more than the tone of polite dismissal, was the catalyst. It was the moment when the center of gravity shifted. Something inside me, quiet for too long, stretched its arms. I went to the small desk by the window, pulled out a pad of stationery I hadn't used since my husband died, and began making a list. Names of lawyers I remembered from the old neighborhood, the address of the clinic, the number of the woman from the doctor's office who had once sent a thank you card addressed simply to the donor who understood. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew I would no longer sit and be managed like a retirement account. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the words blurred into resolve. Then I folded the list, tucked it into my purse, and sat by the window as the maple tree outside flickered under the streetlight like a warning and a promise. When the phone rang again, I let it. I didn't answer. I watched it vibrate across the table like something alive and impatient. I thought about all the times I had been told to be grateful, to be reasonable, to not make a fuss. Gratitude is a leash, I realized, when handed by the wrong person. I turned off the phone. The screen went dark, and for the first time in weeks, the apartment felt like mine again. The quiet was not emptiness. It was space. Space for planning, for breathing, for remembering that survival is not submission. The bruise on my leg had faded to a pale yellow by then, the color of something healing, or something remembering what pain had taught it. I ran my fingers over it gently and whispered, "Not worth a bandage," as if repeating the wound could make it smaller. But it didn't. It made it clearer, cleaner, sharper. And I thought, perhaps that's what healing really is. Not forgetting who cut you, but learning to stop bleeding when they're still holding the knife. The days that followed arranged themselves into a strange stillness, as if the air around me had decided to watch before it moved again. And in that pause, I began to notice things that had always been there, but blurred by habit, the way you only realize a clock ticks when it suddenly stops. My son called less, and when he did, his voice carried that practiced mixture of authority and fatigue, the tone used by doctors when explaining terminal conditions without saying the word. "Mom, have you been taking your medication properly?" he asked one morning, not out of concern, but in the rhythm of someone establishing a case. I said yes, of course, though I could hear him typing in the background, probably updating some file he now considered his. I knew what was coming even before it arrived in the mail. Glossy pamphlets for senior communities with names like Whispering Pines and Golden Haven, all promising dignity in pastel tones, all selling absence disguised as care. I placed them in a neat pile on the counter, each brochure stacked perfectly atop the next, because I have learned that order is a form of defiance. You keep the edges aligned even when your life isn't. In those weeks, I discovered that betrayal rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives in paperwork, in conversations that begin with, "for your own good." Carla came over one afternoon with that expression of bright patience she wears when preparing to scold gently. She brought soup I didn't need, arranged it on the table as though setting up a display for pity. "We just want to make things easier," she said. "Daniel's worried. You've always done so much. It's time to rest." Rest is another word that people like to use when they mean retreat. I told her I'd consider it, though I already knew what she meant. The slow rearrangement of my life until nothing left in it belonged entirely to me. After she left, I poured the soup into the sink. It smelled of dill and condescension, but quiet can be useful if you know how to listen to it. I started walking again, first to the corner, then to the bus stop, each step rehearsing a kind of independence that frightened them more than any argument could. My knee ached, yes, but I have known worse aches, the kind that live in the mind and do not limp, the kind that make you forget your own weight. On the second Thursday after the doctor's visit, I rode the bus to the clinic on my own. I sat by the window, watching the city peel by, the world still noisy with lives that had nothing to do with mine. The driver, a woman with tired eyes and painted nails, nodded at me in the mirror. There was solidarity in that nod, the unspoken understanding between people who show up every day, even when no one expects them to. At the clinic, the receptionist recognized me. Her name was Ellie, the same nurse from that day. She smiled, genuine and unhurried, and asked how my leg was. I told her it was healing, which was true in more ways than one. "You know," she said as she printed a form, "I read your name on one of the plaques in the lobby. Are you the Holloway who helped fund the expansion?" Her voice was light, but I heard the reverence under it, the kind reserved for people who matter. I hadn't heard that tone directed at me in a very long time. For a moment, I almost denied it. Habit again, staying small, keeping the peace. But then I said yes. She looked surprised, and then her face softened with something like pride. "My mother was treated in that wing last year," she said. "She wouldn't have made it otherwise. I just wanted to say thank you." The words lodged in my chest. Gratitude, pure and uncalculated, from a stranger. How rare that is. How healing. I thanked her too, though I can't remember what I said exactly, because I was busy steadying the sudden tremor in my hands, the tremor that comes when the truth you'd hidden from others finally stands up inside you and demands to breathe. That encounter shifted something quiet inside me. When I left the clinic, I didn't go home. I took the long way, walking past the post office, the grocery store, the hair salon, where women my age talk too loudly about grandsons and cholesterol. I stopped at the window of a travel agency, one of those old ones that still has posters of beaches fading in the sun. I stared at them for a while, not because I wanted to go anywhere, but because it reminded me that movement still existed, that not all doors led inward. That afternoon, when I got home, I went through my files, the ones my son hadn't yet touched. I found the bank statements, the checkbook, the letters from the hospital foundation, all the paper evidence of a life lived responsibly. I organized them into folders, labeled in my own handwriting, property, medical, charity, personal. The act itself was small, but it felt like reclaiming territory. Over the next few days, small things began to change. Daniel didn't like that I'd gone out alone. "You should have called," he said. "What if something happened?" I almost laughed at the irony, at the idea that the same people who strip you of power suddenly worry about your safety when you show signs of having any left. I told him I was fine, that the doctor said I was healing well. "She said that?" he asked sharply. "Which doctor?" I told him her name, and he froze for half a breath before saying, "She's new, right?" I said yes, though I suspected he already knew. He ended the call quickly after that. I could hear something in his voice, fear, maybe, or recognition that the narrative he'd built about my frailty had cracked. I didn't call back. At night, I started to keep a notebook by my bed. I wrote in it everything I noticed, the change in his tone, the dates of his visits, the way Carla's kindness came wrapped in control. It wasn't paranoia, it was documentation. You learn, after a certain number of disappointments, that memory alone is too fragile to protect you. The notebook became a small fortress. I wrote in it each night until my hand cramped, and when I closed it, I felt steadier, as if the act of naming things anchored me against their erasure. One evening, while sorting old letters, I found one from my late husband, dated 30 years ago, written in his tight, careful script. It had been tucked behind a utility bill. "If they ever make you feel small," he had written, "remember what you built. You were the foundation." I had forgotten that letter existed. Reading it was like hearing his voice through the wall of time, steady and unhurried. I folded it back into its envelope and placed it in my notebook. Proof, again, not of money or property, but of the truth that I had been more than useful. I had been necessary. As the weeks stretched on, the quiet between my son and me grew heavier, not like distance, but like a fog that dulls everything it touches. I began to see the ways in which they were reshaping the story. Carla called my neighbors to check in. I learned this from Mrs. Leary across the hall, who whispered apologetically that they just seemed concerned. Concern is such a tidy word. It hides the fingerprints of control. I thanked her and said nothing else. I did not want witnesses. I wanted witnesses later, when the time came. There was a moment, one Sunday afternoon, when I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized myself. Not because I had aged, I had already made peace with the folds and shadows of my face, but because I saw, behind my own eyes, the glint of calculation that I once thought belonged only to others. I realized that if they could construct a story about my incapacity, I could construct one about my compliance. I began to perform a little. Forget a date here, misplace a paper there. Let them believe I was softening. It bought me time. The quieter they thought I was, the more space I had to think. One morning, I visited the library and asked the reference desk for information on estate law. The librarian, a tall woman with silver braids and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, didn't question me. She simply printed out a list of resources and slid them across the counter. "Good for you," she said quietly. "Most people wait too long to ask." I smiled, small and conspiratorial. It felt good to be treated as someone still capable of acting. At home, I spent hours reading. The language was dense, full of clauses and conditions, but I was good at parsing meaning from noise. I had done it all my life in subtler forms, decoding men's silences, interpreting employers' smiles, understanding the gap between what people say and what they do. Law was just a formalized version of the same skill. By the end of that week, I knew exactly what they were trying to set up, and more importantly, I knew how to stop it. But I didn't move yet. The first escalation of any war is often silence, the patience before the strike. Daniel came again that weekend. He brought flowers, lilies, the kind that smell like funerals. He placed them on the counter and smiled too wide. "I've been thinking, Mom," he began. "Maybe it's time to consider assisted living. They have great programs now, yoga, art classes." I asked if he had already looked at places. He hesitated, then said, "Just options." Options, another soft word that means decisions already made. I nodded, thanked him for the flowers, and when he left, I took the vase from the counter, emptied the water, and threw the lilies in the trash. Their sweetness was unbearable. That night, I made another list, shorter this time. Things that were mine and things that weren't. The things that were mine, my memories, my will, my choice of when to speak and when to remain silent, were enough to begin with. The rest could be reclaimed. I tucked the list inside the notebook and went to bed with the light on. The maple outside trembled in the wind, leaves flickering like pages turning. Somewhere, in another apartment, someone was playing an old jazz record, the kind with scratches that make the song sound older than it is. It comforted me. Age, after all, is just a form of endurance. By the next morning, I knew what I had to do, though I wouldn't yet have called it rebellion. It began with a visit to the bus stop, then the clinic, then the quiet walk to the notary office 2 blocks away. It began with small steps that no one would notice, each one carried out with the calm of a woman no longer asking for permission. The first escalation wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. The bruise on my leg had vanished, but its ghost remained, a faint yellow circle reminding me that healing and remembering are sometimes the same thing. I was done being careful. I was beginning to move. The shift began, not with a revelation, but with a sound, a file drawer closing in the lawyer's office, that clean metallic slide that punctuated an hour of quiet explanations and deliberate signatures. The woman across the desk, sharp-eyed but kind, had a voice like the steady hum of a refrigerator, constant and grounding. Her name was Margaret Cho, and she had been recommended by the librarian who'd slipped me the list of legal resources. I had called her the day after Daniel's last visit, my voice calm, even cheerful. "I'd like to review my financial arrangements," I'd said, and she didn't ask why or with whom I was arranging them. Now, sitting in that small office that smelled faintly of printer toner and lemon oil, I watched her assemble the documents that would redirect my future. "You're not the first," she said quietly, as if reading my shame before it could rise. "And you won't be the last. Families can become very professional about control." The word professional stung me with its accuracy. I signed the revocation of power of attorney with the same hand that had once signed permission slips and donation checks. The pen didn't tremble. When it was done, I felt no triumph, only a slow uncoiling in my chest, like a knot realizing it had been mistaken for a heart. When I stepped back out into the afternoon light, the city looked strangely tender, as if it knew what I had done and approved. The air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen. I walked without hurry, past the bakery with its display of sugar-dusted pastries, past the flower stall where tulips nodded like conspirators. I bought a single white carnation, cheap, steady, unpretentious, and tucked it into the lapel of my coat, a small badge of completion. Then, almost without thinking, I walked the 2 blocks to the clinic. Ellie was at the desk again, and when she saw me, she smiled as if I were a friend. "You're early for your follow-up," she teased. "Old habits," I said. "I just like being around people who do their jobs properly." She laughed and told me the doctor wasn't in today, that it was her research day, but I could leave a message if I wanted. I didn't. I just wanted to stand there for a moment, to feel the clean order of the place I had helped build without anyone knowing. That evening, when I returned home, I made dinner for myself for the first time in months. Not soup from a carton, not microwaved leftovers, but a meal with steps, potatoes peeled, onions chopped, butter melted, parsley sprinkled. The rhythm of cooking came back like a song half remembered. I set the table for one, but placed a second plate across from me anyway, a small act of defiance against loneliness. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, thinking of how strange it was that something as simple as cutting food could feel like reclamation. After dinner, I opened the window and let the air in. The street below smelled of wet asphalt and the faint sweetness of rain on brick. Somewhere a child was practicing piano, uneven but determined. I sat listening until the notes found a pattern. The next morning, I took the bus downtown to the community bank, the smaller branch, the one where the tellers still wore name tags that weren't digital screens. I asked to open a new account in my name only. The young woman at the desk, her nails painted the color of sunrise, nodded briskly. "We can do that for you today, Mrs. Holloway. Do you want online access?" I shook my head. "No, paper statements, please. I like seeing what's mine." She smiled as though it were a charming quirk, not a declaration of independence. I deposited a modest amount, enough to feel real, but not enough to alarm anyone watching. When I left, the sun was breaking through the clouds, pale and persistent. I stopped by a second-hand store on the way home and bought a small wooden box with a brass clasp. Inside it, I placed the new checkbook, my notebook, and the letter from my husband, a private archive. The days that followed carried a new texture, a sense of movement that wasn't visible to anyone but me. I began walking in the mornings before the street sweepers came, when the air still smelled of night. I would stop at a small cafe near the bus stop, the kind that opens before dawn for nurses and janitors. The man behind the counter, whose name tag said Ray J., learned my order after 2 visits: black coffee, 1 sugar, no lid. We didn't talk much, but I liked the quiet competence of his gestures. One morning he asked, "You on your way to work?" I almost laughed, but then caught myself. "Something like that," I said. It wasn't a lie. I was working, just in a different currency. Meanwhile, the calls from Daniel grew sporadic, uncertain. He was waiting, I realized, for me to yield, to call him in panic over some bureaucratic tangle that would justify his intrusion. I denied him that satisfaction. When he finally did call, his voice was cautious, testing the air. "Mom, I got a notice from the bank. Something about updated authorizations. Did you—" I interrupted gently. "Yes, I did." Silence on the line, thick and startled. "Why?" he asked at last. "Because I can." Another pause. "You didn't tell me." I smiled into the receiver. "You didn't ask." He muttered something about confusion and hung up. I felt no guilt, only a strange lightness, the kind that comes from removing a stone you've carried so long you mistook it for part of your body. Around that time, Ellie called from the clinic. "The doctor wanted me to remind you," she said, "that there's a patient council meeting next week. They're looking for community members. You'd be perfect." The idea startled me. I hadn't thought of being useful to anything beyond my own survival in years. But the more I considered it, the more it made sense. I told her I'd attend. The meeting was in a small conference room with bad lighting and a table scarred by decades of elbows, but I loved it instantly. There were 6 of us, a retired teacher, a bus driver, a young mother, 2 nurses, and me. They talked about budget allocations, volunteer schedules, the small indignities of health bureaucracy. When I spoke about how dignity should never depend on who signs the checks, they listened. The doctor, seated at the head of the table, nodded slowly. "That's exactly it," she said. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen not as someone to be managed, but as someone with meaning. After that, my days gained rhythm. Mornings at the cafe, afternoons with the council, evenings reading on the sofa with the lamp casting its soft golden cone. The world hadn't changed, but its temperature had shifted. I found myself humming again, an old habit from the years when I still believed in luck. I even started wearing lipstick again, the dark berry shade my husband used to say made me look decisive. One morning, while brushing my hair, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and thought, not cruelly, not wistfully, just honestly, "You're still here." Then, one evening, I received a letter, a real letter, postmarked and stamped, from the hospital foundation. It was a formal acknowledgement of my previous donations and a notice about new community initiatives. At the bottom, handwritten in blue ink, was a note from the director. "We would love to invite you to our annual luncheon. Your support remains part of our story." I held the paper for a long time, tracing the words. Part of our story. It felt like an answer to a question I hadn't dared ask. I wrote back that I would attend. The luncheon was held in the same building where my son had humiliated me. But now I entered through the front, not the patient's door. The receptionist offered me a name tag, and when I pinned it to my jacket, I realized my hands weren't shaking. The room was bright, filled with polite chatter, but I wasn't intimidated. The doctor who had defended me was there. When she saw me, she came over, smiling warmly. "I was hoping you'd come," she said. "You were the spark that started this." I didn't know what she meant until later, when she introduced me to the group as a founding supporter of the clinic's Compassion Fund. There was applause, brief but genuine. My son's words, "She's not worth a bandage," flickered in my mind, and for the first time, they didn't sting. They sounded like a line from someone else's play, poorly written, already forgotten. After the luncheon, I walked home instead of taking the bus. The city was alive with the small heroics of ordinary people, street sweepers, vendors, mothers tugging strollers uphill. I felt among them again, not above, not below, among. When I reached my building, the maple tree outside was shedding the last of its leaves, and the pavement was a soft quilt of amber and red. I stopped to touch the trunk, rough under my palm. "We made it through another season," I whispered. Inside, I brewed tea and opened my notebook. I crossed out the section labeled Fear. Below it, I wrote a new heading, Action. The words looked bold, almost reckless, but I didn't flinch. I thought of my husband's letter, of the doctor's quiet defiance, of Ellie's gratitude, of the small army of women who had stitched dignity into corners where none was expected. I wasn't done, not by a long stretch. I was only now remembering how to live on my own terms. The midpoint, if life were a story, had come, not with fanfare, not with revenge, but with the simple, sacred act of choosing to sign my own name, choosing to be more than a wound disguised as gratitude, choosing at last to belong fully to myself. I felt the shift before it showed itself in words, the faint tremor in the atmosphere that warns you a storm has already chosen you as its witness. It began with a phone call, late on a Sunday night when the air was too still for sleep. The voice on the other end was Daniel's, but pitched strangely high, an imitation of tenderness that fooled neither of us. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking it's time for a family meeting. There are some things we need to talk about face to face." I asked him what kind of things, and he hesitated just long enough for the truth to flicker through his pause like lightning behind clouds. "It's about your safety," he said finally, and the word safety rolled off his tongue like a prepackaged excuse, a word he could hide behind if I decided to protest. I agreed to come, not because I wanted to, but because the curiosity inside me was stronger than fear. I wanted to see how far they would go. Their house had changed since my last visit. The furniture was newer, the colors colder, the smell of air freshener replacing what used to be the scent of cooking. Carla opened the door with a smile too bright for evening light. "You look wonderful," she said, and her eyes flicked immediately to my purse, as though calculating what I had brought or might take away. Daniel was already seated in the living room, a folder on the coffee table in front of him. The television was off, the curtains drawn, as if secrecy required ceremony. I sat down slowly, the weight of my body deliberate, claiming my space the way a queen might lower herself onto her throne just before the council commits treason. He began with a practiced calm. "Mom, you've been making a lot of decisions lately, changing bank accounts, seeing lawyers, taking buses alone. We're just concerned." I asked if concern now required documentation, nodding toward the folder. His mouth tightened. "We just want to make sure you're protected. We found a wonderful community living center, beautiful gardens, medical staff on site, activities, everything you could need. It's not a home, it's a lifestyle." He said the word lifestyle, the way salesmen say warranty. Carla chimed in then, her voice syrupy with false optimism. "It's called Maple Grove. Isn't that a lovely coincidence? Like your tree outside." I almost laughed. The coincidence felt like mockery. He opened the folder and pushed a brochure toward me. On the cover was an image of smiling elderly couples walking arm in arm along manicured paths, the kind of picture designed to erase the smell of antiseptic and the sound of locked doors. "We've already toured it," Daniel said. "They have your name on a waiting list, but we can move you up if we put down a deposit. I can take care of that." The audacity of that word, deposit, hung between us. "And what happens to my apartment?" I asked. Carla answered before he could. "We can sublet it. The income will help cover costs. It'll make everything easier." I could almost admire their choreography, the way they passed deceit like a baton, never dropping the rhythm. I let them talk. I let them believe I was listening. I even picked up the brochure, flipping through its glossy pages while my mind wandered elsewhere, to the lawyer's office, to the signatures that now protected me, to the bank account Daniel didn't know existed. The old me might have shouted, might have pleaded, but I had learned the power of silence, the way it forces others to fill it with their own guilt. When they finished, I closed the brochure and said softly, "I'll think about it." Relief flashed across their faces, the relief of predators mistaking stillness for surrender. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window and wrote down everything they had said, every gesture, every phrase. I added it to my growing collection of notes. The maple outside was almost bare now, its branches black against the yellow streetlight. I thought of Maple Grove, of the gardens they promised, and the irony made me smile. The next morning, I called Margaret Cho. They've escalated, I told her. They want me institutionalized. She didn't sound surprised. Then it's time we escalate too, she said. We arranged to meet that afternoon. At her office, she listened carefully as I recounted the conversation. She took notes with a fountain pen, her handwriting neat and precise. They're building a case for incapacity, she said. It's common. They'll start collecting statements. Neighbors, doctors, anyone who can testify that you're forgetful or unstable. We'll get ahead of it. She advised me to document every interaction, which I had already been doing, and to be cautious about what I said to them on the phone. Record if you can, she added. Some states allow it. I nodded. I've been keeping everything in a notebook, I said. Then keep writing, she replied. The truth needs a paper trail. Leaving her office, I felt strangely exhilarated. The fear that had once paralyzed me was transforming into clarity. Betrayal, I realized, isn't a thunderclap. It's an education. Each cruelty teaches you a new language of survival. I stopped at a small electronics store and bought a simple recorder, the kind journalists use. The young man at the counter explained how it worked, unaware of the revolution he was arming. That night, I called Daniel back. I let the conversation unfold naturally, my voice mild, his confident. Within minutes, he said it again, that he was only trying to protect me, that I was becoming forgetful, that the lawyer I'd seen was taking advantage of an old woman. I said little, only asked him to repeat himself when the recorder's light blinked red. 2 days later, Carla arrived unannounced. She brought muffins this time, blueberry, the smell too sweet to be sincere. I just wanted to check in, she said. You've been avoiding us. I invited her in, offered tea, watched her eyes wander over the room as if she were mentally appraising the furniture. She asked about my health, my sleep, whether I'd been feeling confused. The script was transparent. I smiled and answered calmly, letting her fill the air with the kind of words that, when written down later, would read like evidence. When she finally left, I sat down at the table and wrote every detail while it was fresh. Her questions, her tone, the way she glanced at my medication bottles as though expecting them to confess. That week, I went back to the clinic for the council meeting. The doctor was there, listening, as we discussed budget cuts and patient care. Afterward, she pulled me aside. You seem lighter, she said. I laughed softly. I'm just learning how to carry things differently. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. If you ever need a professional statement about your mental competence, she said, I'd be happy to write one, for your records. The offer stunned me. It was as if she had read the battle unfolding in my silence. I thanked her, and she added, sometimes being believed starts with a piece of paper. I left the clinic that day with a copy of my medical report, clean, factual, signed and dated. Proof again of who I was and who I still am. The following Saturday brought the second confrontation. Daniel appeared at my door without calling. His face was tight with rehearsed indignation. Why didn't you tell me you changed your accounts? Do you have any idea what that does to the tax filings? His voice was louder than the hallway deserved. I invited him in, offered him coffee. He refused, pacing like a man who'd lost his script. You're being manipulated, he said. That lawyer is just using you. You're not thinking clearly. I stood very still, the calm opposite of his fury. I think more clearly now than I have in years, I said. Sit down, Daniel. The use of his full name startled him. He sat. I opened a drawer and placed a small envelope on the table. What's that? He asked. A letter from my lawyer, I said. It outlines the changes I've made and confirms their legality. You might want to read it before you embarrass yourself further. His eyes narrowed. You don't have to threaten me. I smiled. I'm not threatening you. I'm informing you. There's a difference. He read the letter in silence. When he looked up, his face had softened, but not with remorse. It was calculation, the quick pivot of a man searching for a new tactic. I just want what's best for you, he said again. I leaned forward slightly, then stopped taking what's mine. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the way two people do when they realize they no longer share the same definition of love. He stood abruptly, muttering that he'd call me later. At the door, he turned. You're making a mistake, he said. We're family. I said nothing, only watched him leave. When the door closed, I exhaled, not in relief, but in confirmation. The second escalation had begun. In the days that followed, the tension thickened. He stopped calling, but small harassments took his place. Letters from insurance companies, updating my information, a visit from a social worker who claimed she'd received an anonymous report about my declining cognitive health. I invited her in, served her tea, and produced the doctor's statement before she could open her file. She left embarrassed, apologizing for the mistake. I wasn't angry. I was impressed. The efficiency of Daniel's campaign was almost professional. It was the same efficiency I had once admired in him when he was young and ambitious. It hurt to see that precision turned against me, but pain has a way of sharpening rather than dulling. I began to counter quietly. Every document he filed, I requested copies of. Every official who visited, I thanked in writing, copying my lawyer. The paper trail grew, neat and undeniable. Margaret called it my armor. You're doing beautifully, she said. He can't touch what's documented. But emotional warfare doesn't end with legality. It seeks your spirit. He sent flowers once, lilies again, with a card that read, You raised me to be responsible. I laughed aloud, a sound that startled even me. I threw them away, the petals bruising against the garbage bag like small defeated hearts. The third week of silence was the hardest. I caught myself missing him, or perhaps the idea of him, the little boy who used to curl up beside me during thunderstorms, whose hair smelled of soap and sleep. I wondered if he remembered any of that, or if adulthood had edited the tenderness out of him. One evening, I took out the old photo album, the one with corners held by yellowing tape. I turned the pages slowly, tracing the faces that time had erased. I stopped at a picture of us at the beach, him building a sandcastle while I watched. I remembered the sound of the waves, his laughter, his insistence that we stay until the tide came in so the sea could visit his castle. I closed the book gently. Love, I realized, doesn't disappear. It just changes its direction when it's no longer welcome. The next day, Margaret called. There's been movement, she said. He's filed for temporary guardianship. For a moment, the room tilted. I sat down hard. He what? It won't go far, she assured me. We'll contest it immediately, but you need to be ready. There may be a hearing. I thanked her, my voice steady even as my pulse raced. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, the city glowing faintly beyond the glass, and thought about the strange cruelty of being erased by your own blood. But beneath the sorrow, something fiercer stirred. He had overplayed his hand. A guardianship hearing required proof, and I had proof enough to fill a courtroom. When the notice arrived 2 weeks later, I was ready. I dressed carefully that morning, in my navy suit and pearl earrings, not as costume, but as armor. At the courthouse, Margaret met me at the entrance. You sure you're up for this? She asked. I've been up for worse, I said. The hearing was brief, almost anticlimactic. Daniel spoke first, painting a portrait of a frail, confused woman, alone and vulnerable. His words were polished, his concern convincing. I watched him as he spoke, wondering if he heard the hollowness of his own voice. Then it was my turn. Margaret handed the judge the folder we had prepared: medical reports, financial records, transcripts of calls, letters, and finally, the recording. I didn't need to speak much. The tape did the work for me. His own words, cold and patronizing, filled the room. When it ended, the judge looked at him over her glasses and said, "Mr. Holloway, this petition is not only unsupported, but deeply inappropriate." Her tone left no room for misunderstanding. The gavel struck, final and echoing. It was over. Outside the courthouse, the air was bright and cold. Margaret shook my hand. "You did it," she said. I looked at her and smiled faintly. "No," I said. "I just stopped letting him do it to me." I took the bus home, sitting by the window as the city moved past, the streets the same but lighter somehow, as if the buildings themselves were exhaling. When I reached my stop, the maple tree was waiting, its bare branches stark against the winter sky. I stood for a moment beneath it, the cold biting but clean, and whispered, "You're still standing. So am I." Then I went upstairs, brewed a cup of tea, and opened my notebook to a new page. At the top, in neat letters, I wrote, "The test is over." The page beneath it remained blank for a long time before I began to write what came next. The morning after the hearing, I woke before dawn, as I always have, though the air felt different, as if some invisible weight had shifted from the rafters to the floor. I made coffee the old way, boiling water in the dented kettle that had followed me through 3 homes and 1 marriage, the handle wrapped in electrical tape from when my husband repaired it years ago, saying it would last another decade. It had lasted longer than he did. I poured the coffee into my chipped china mug and sat at the table, the same table where Daniel had once spread out those papers that pretended to protect me. The apartment was still. The maple outside my window had shed all its leaves, its bare branches drawn like ink lines against a silver sky. Winter had come quietly. I thought of the gavel's sound, the judge's voice declaring my competence, the faint tremor that had passed through Daniel's body when his performance collapsed under the weight of his own words. I had expected to feel triumph, but what I felt instead was an immense aching clarity, the way air feels sharper after a thunderstorm. It wasn't victory, it was reclamation, the act of returning to yourself after too long a detour. I didn't call him afterward. I didn't need to. The silence between us had become its own kind of dialogue, eloquent and unyielding. But the world, I've learned, never allows a wound to close cleanly. There's always one more test, one final demand for proof. Mine came 3 weeks later, on a gray afternoon when the mail arrived heavy with envelopes. Among the bills and catalogs was one from the foundation, printed on heavy paper, embossed with their insignia. Inside was an invitation to their annual donors' dinner, the same event I had attended quietly years ago, long before anonymity became armor. I held the card in my hand for a long moment, tracing the letters. At the bottom, in handwriting I recognize now as the director's, were the words, "We'd love to honor you publicly this year." I thought about it for 2 days, walking through the decision the way one walks through a house in darkness, remembering where the furniture stands. Then I called to confirm my attendance. On the evening of the dinner, I dressed slowly, deliberately. The navy suit again, freshly pressed, the pearl earrings, a silk scarf my husband had given me on our 20th anniversary, its edges slightly frayed, but still luminous. I looked at myself in the mirror, not with vanity, but with curiosity. The woman reflected there was not the one who had sat small and silent in a doctor's waiting room months ago. Her posture had lengthened. Her eyes no longer flinched at their own steadiness. I pinned the carnation to my lapel again, a pale echo of the one I had worn the day I signed away Daniel's control. Then I took the bus, as I always did. The driver greeted me by name. The city slid by in its usual mixture of noise and anonymity, neon blinking over puddles, people moving in practiced haste. I felt separate from it, and yet utterly part of it, the way one feels when finally occupying their own life without apology. The venue was the same hospital hall, polished floors, white tablecloths, the quiet clatter of silverware against china. The air hummed with polite conversation. Faces turned toward me as I entered, some with recognition, others with that vague curiosity people reserve for names they've seen on plaques but never attached to a body. The doctor spotted me first. She came over, radiant, her expression not of pity or respectability, but of genuine welcome. "You came," she said. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, and meant it. She led me to a table near the front, beside the director and a few other donors. There were speeches, toasts, the soft rustle of applause. When they announced my name, inviting me to the podium, I felt the old tremor again. But it wasn't fear this time. It was gravity, the awareness of standing where truth was owed. The light was warm on my face as I began to speak. I hadn't written a speech. I trusted memory. "When I first gave to this hospital," I said, "I asked that my name be kept off the records. I thought anonymity was dignity. I thought humility was the safest form of love. But humility, I've learned, can become another name for erasure. If no one knows what you built, they can convince you it was never yours." A hush settled. The clinking of glasses stopped. I continued, my voice steady, but not hard. "Months ago, in this very building, someone I loved said I wasn't worth a bandage. He believed it, because I had taught him through my silence that my worth was negotiable. But I'm here tonight because someone else, a doctor who remembered what generosity looks like, answered him differently. She said, 'Funny, she pays for the entire ward.' And in that moment, I realized something simple. Dignity doesn't need witnesses, but it does need acknowledgement." I paused, feeling the weight of the room settle around me. "I am not telling this story to shame anyone," I said. "I'm telling it because too many of us disappear into the kindness of others, mistaking control for care. We shrink to fit the version of ourselves they find convenient. But invisibility is not peace. It's a slow death. So tonight, I'm reclaiming my name. My donations will no longer be anonymous. I want it known that the Holloway Fund exists because a woman who was told she wasn't worth a bandage decided that healing was her inheritance." For a moment, there was silence, then applause, quiet at first, then rising. I looked toward the back of the room, half expecting to see Daniel there, his face pale with recognition, but he wasn't. Perhaps that was for the best. The words weren't meant for him. They were meant for me, and for every woman who had ever been quietly erased from her own story. After the speeches, the director came to me, eyes bright with something between gratitude and awe. "That was extraordinary," she said. "Would you consider joining the advisory board?" I smiled. "Only if I can be difficult," I replied, and she laughed. I stayed a while longer, speaking to nurses, to other donors, to the janitor who had once helped me find my way out of the building after dark. When I finally stepped outside, the air was sharp with winter. Snow had begun to fall, thin flakes swirling under the streetlights. I walked slowly toward the bus stop, my heels clicking against the pavement. The sound was steady, a rhythm I hadn't heard in years, my own. When I reached home, there was a message on my answering machine. Daniel's voice, cautious, almost unfamiliar. "Mom, I heard about the hearing and the dinner. I guess I didn't realize how much you'd done. I'm sorry if we hurt you. Maybe we can talk." His words trailed off into static. I stood listening, the message replaying itself in its fragile sincerity. Part of me wanted to call back, to offer the absolution that mothers are trained to dispense like breath. But another part, the part that had survived this long battle for visibility, knew that forgiveness can sometimes become another form of surrender. I deleted the message, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. There are silences that protect, and this was one of them. Later that night, I opened my notebook, the one that had begun as a collection of evidence and had now become a diary of deliverance. I turned to a fresh page and wrote the date in careful script. Beneath it, I wrote, "Today I spoke my name aloud." I paused, the pen hovering, then added, "And the world did not collapse." I closed the notebook and placed it in the wooden box, alongside the checkbook, the letter from my husband, and the faded photo of Daniel at the beach. The box was heavy, but the weight comforted me. It was the weight of proof, of a life documented and owned. Before bed, I made one last call, not to Daniel, but to Margaret Cho. "It's done," I told her. "Good," she said. "How do you feel?" I thought about it, searching for the right word. "Solid," I said finally, "like a door that has learned how to close." We said goodnight, and I turned off the light. The room filled with darkness, not oppressive, but complete, a kind of honest dark that doesn't hide anything. I lay awake a while, listening to the wind pressing softly against the window pane, the faint creak of the radiator, the pulse of my own steady heart. In that moment, I understood that the real climax hadn't been the courtroom, nor the speech, nor the signatures that returned my autonomy. It was this quiet, ordinary night, this small room where everything was finally still and wholly mine. For the first time in years, I didn't feel watched, managed, or owed. I felt present. I thought of the maple tree, stripped bare but unbroken, its branches waiting for spring without apology. Survival, I realized, is not defiance. It's patience. The patience to outlive those who underestimate you. The patience to let your truth grow roots even in winter. I drifted to sleep with that thought, the city breathing softly around me, the snow still falling like unasked questions, dissolving into answers no one could take away. In the weeks that followed, the noise around me settled into something quieter, something almost gentle. The days came without confrontation or worry, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't wake with the sense of being observed or evaluated. I moved through my apartment like a woman reacquainting herself with her own furniture, touching the edges of tables and window frames, polishing the kettle, watering the plant that had somehow survived my neglect. The maple outside stood skeletal against the gray February sky, a dark lace of branches that looked both fragile and undefeated. I watched it each morning from my kitchen window, the way one might watch an old friend who no longer needs to speak to be understood. I knew what it was saying. It was saying, "You are still here." That simple truth had become the most extravagant comfort. The doctor called one morning to ask if I might come speak at a volunteer orientation, to tell new recruits what community meant from a patient's perspective. Her voice was warm, unhurried, and when I hesitated, she said softly, "They should hear it from someone who knows that care can be both a gift and a wound." I agreed. When I arrived at the clinic a week later, the lobby looked the same scuffed floors, the same posters curling slightly at the edges, but it felt different to me now, like a place that no longer carried the echo of humiliation. I spoke to the volunteers in the same small conference room where we held council meetings. I told them about dignity, about the difference between helping and deciding for someone, about how even the gentlest pity can carry poison if it erases the other's will. They listened with the quiet attention I had once begged from my own family. When I finished, a young nurse with a nervous smile said, "You remind me of my grandmother. She always says people underestimate the old." I laughed and told her, "They do, but sometimes that's our best camouflage." Afterward, I walked home instead of taking the bus. The streets were wet with melting snow, and the air smelled faintly of metal and earth. It was one of those rare afternoons when the city feels almost honest. No pretense, no noise, just the sound of tires on slush and the occasional flutter of pigeons startled into flight. I passed the bakery where Daniel and I used to stop when he was a boy, the one that now sells espresso to students who call their parents only on birthdays. I paused at the window, watching the slow rhythm of the baker's hands shaping dough. There was something soothing in that repetition, the daily making and remaking of sustenance. I thought of all the invisible work I had done in my life, the quiet maintenance of others' comfort, and for the first time, I didn't feel bitter about it. I simply acknowledged it as fact, one of many facts that made up the topography of who I am. I kept walking, my reflection flickering across the glass of passing storefronts, each pane catching a slightly different version of me, older, freer, not trying to reconcile the past, but learning to let it coexist with the present. At home, I found an envelope slipped under my door. The handwriting was Daniel's, stiff, uncertain. Inside was a letter, not long. He wrote that he had been thinking about what I said at the dinner, about what the judge had said, about what he had done. He said he didn't know how to ask for forgiveness, but wanted to understand what had made him so afraid of losing control. "You always seem so strong," he wrote. "Maybe I mistook your silence for weakness." I read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it in the wooden box with the others. I didn't respond, not yet. There are answers that take time to become true. Some apologies require silence to ripen. I wasn't ready to teach him the lesson he needed to learn, that remorse is only meaningful when it isn't met with immediate absolution. For now, the distance was still necessary. It was the only space where I could breathe fully. That night, I cooked a small dinner, roasted vegetables, a slice of bread, a glass of wine I had been saving for a celebration I could never name. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, not because the food was remarkable, but because it was mine. Ownership, I've discovered, isn't about possessions. It's about choosing without permission. After dinner, I sat by the window again. The streetlights had begun to glow, each one blurring into a halo against the fog. A young couple walked by, their laughter rising and then vanishing into the dark. I thought of my younger self, the one who believed endurance was the same as love, who confused giving with disappearing. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, but also that her mistake had been noble, that survival often begins as misunderstanding. Before bed, I took out my notebook. The pages were nearly full now, the handwriting steadier, the ink darker. On the last page, I wrote, "Resolution is not revenge. It's the peace that comes when you finally recognize that no one is coming to rescue you. And that's not tragedy, it's liberation." I underlined the last word, not for emphasis, but as a kind of quiet applause to myself. I closed the book and set it on the table beside the cooling cup of tea, the steam a thin ribbon rising into the room. The sound of the clock filled the silence, steady and forgiving. In bed, I left the curtains open. The moon was thin and white, hanging low over the city, its light pale but persistent. I watched it until my eyes grew heavy. Somewhere below, a siren wailed, then faded, leaving behind the soft hum of the refrigerator and the even softer beat of my heart. I thought of the women I had met at the clinic, the nurse with freckles, the mother with tired eyes, the elderly patient who smiled despite her pain. I thought of the letter from Daniel, the voice of the doctor, the maple tree outside that would soon bud again. All these pieces of my life, scattered and ordinary, formed a mosaic that finally looked like belonging. If another woman ever reads these words, perhaps someone sitting alone at her kitchen table, wondering if she has already vanished, I would tell her this: silence is not always surrender, but it is never safety. Speak once, even if your voice trembles. Write your name where it cannot be erased. And when they tell you that your season has passed, remind them that winter is not the end of growth, only the patience before it. The room was dark when I closed my eyes, but it was not the darkness of fear. It was the calm dark of completion. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the branches of the maple like a whisper, and I could almost hear it answering back, the thought that carried me into sleep. I am still here. I am still enough. I am, at last, my own.